SPIPA Healthy Families Video Disclaimer. The information contained in the video content posted to this site represents the views and opinions of the original creators of such video content and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of the South Puget Intertribal Planning Agency. The mere appearance of such video content on this site does not constitute an endorsement by SPIPA or its affiliates of such video content. The video content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. SPIPA does not make any representation or warranties with respect to the accuracy, applicability, fitness, or completeness of the video content. SPIPA does not warrant the performance, effectiveness, or applicability of any sites listed or linked to in any video content. The video content is not intended to be a substitute for professional advice. Always seek professional advice with any questions you may have regarding the subject of the video content. SPIPA hereby disclaims any and all liability to any party for any direct, indirect, implied, punitive, special, incidental, or other consequential damages arising directly or indirectly from any use of the video content which is provided as is and without warranties. The production of this video content was supported by a grant from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Administration for Children and Families. Its content does not necessarily represent the official views or opinions of HHS and ACF.
So what we are talking about is development, and we're talking about today, we're talking about from 5 years to 10 years. And the reason development is so important is that I really like people to start with what normal is. Because when you know what normal is, you respond differently to it than if you think that behavior is abnormal. And so it's important that people recognize normal developmental behavior. It doesn't mean you don't address the behavior. It doesn't mean you don't coach to it or teach to it, but it's different than reacting to it as if you're thinking something's wrong. So we're going to start with the 5-year-old, and I want to start first of all by talking a little bit about what we call equilibrium and disequilibrium. So up until about age 7, we have what we call disequilibrium for about 6 months, and we have equilibrium for about 6 months. And so with your 1-year-olds all the way through 5, your years of your months of equilibrium tend to be, so if you turn 5, you have 3 months after 5 that you're in equilibrium. And then 3 months after 5, for example, or 3 months after 5, you start your disequilibrium. And that next 6 months, which follows till 3 months after 5.5, is the end of that disequilibrium. So it's 6 months. Then you start moving back into equilibrium as we get closer to the year. So for example, 2-year-olds, it's not terrible 2s, it's actually terrible 2.5. 2 is actually equilibrium. And then around I'd say around 27 months, we start to see that disequilibrium start, and it lasts until kids are approximately 33 months, and then they start back into the equilibrium for the next year. Now in equilibrium, kids are sort of more self-contained, they seem happier, they sleep better, they eat better, they're not as emotionally intense. And then when you hit the disequilibriums of that year, you basically start running into the more challenging behaviors where they have a harder time going to sleep, harder time staying asleep. They are more emotionally intense and volatile. They have more tantrums. They are harder to get them to eat. So you start to see all these behaviors. Now, the reason this is happening is as that brain develops and they are going through these stages for the first 5 years, generally what happens is during equilibrium, they're practice times. There are times when there's not a lot of new going on. And then the disequilibriums is when there's a lot of new development all at once in a lot of different arenas. And because there's so much new, it really just kind of pulls the rug out from under them. And you'll notice that all those behaviors start. Then they'll have a period of 6 months where they're just sort of coasting, practicing what they already have in terms of their repertoire. And then we'll see that growth spurt again. Now, after 5, generally we say starting 7, but 6 is a little like transition year. But after 6.5 or so, we start seeing equilibrium and disequilibrium by the year instead of by 6 months. So 7 is a year of disequilibrium, 8 is a year of equilibrium, 9 is a year of disequilibrium, 10 is a year of equilibrium. So after that period, you'll see every other year is going to be a period of equilibrium and disequilibrium. Now, within that, the other thing I want to remind people is that sometimes people will say, well, it doesn't feel like equilibrium to me right now, when they enter a period and it's actually a year or a stage of equilibrium. And I'll say, well, sometimes that's what we would call parental disequilibrium, because what happens is they've moved into a new stage and we're still trying to deal with them with the same tools and the same expectations as they had 6 months earlier, and they're not there anymore. So it's almost our disequilibrium. It's almost like we have to catch up with where they are in development in order for us to feel like we've kind of got it again, like we can handle this again. So with this in mind, it's why it's so important to be sure that every time your kids are moving to a new developmental stage, every like maybe 3 months before they turn 5, 3 months before they turn 6, etc., that you get the information, pull out the notes, and look at what normal behavior is so that you know what to expect and what's coming. I think that helps a lot with the parental disequilibrium of sort of being caught off guard with the development. It's like, oh yeah, this is what I read about was coming. So that's what we're going to be doing, is talking about the different developmental stages that are normal development. So we're going to start with the 5-year-old. And I don't know how many of you heard the 4-year-old development, but 3 and 4 are two really challenging years. 3 is a very oppositional age and stage, and 4 is a really big stage. They just are very big. They're loud, they're rambunctious, they're risk takers, they're kind of mouthy. And so 5 comes, and I promise people through 3 and 4, it's like 2 hard years and you've got 5 coming. Because from 5 to 5.5, and I want to say 5.5, I used to just say 5, but then people are like, what? You told me. It's only the year, that part of disequilibrium or equilibrium. But from 5 to 5.5 is probably one of the sweetest periods of development you're going to run into. So at 5, they usually want to be good. They mean to be good. They have a really positive outlook on life. Their language is positive. Their attitude is positive. Mothers are the center of their world. They focus on them they focus on their tried and true. They want to be with them all the time. They want them to do things for them. They're very self-limiting. They know what they can do. They know what they can't do. They adore their moms, but if something goes wrong, it's always the mom's fault. So at 5 and a little bit at 6, you're going to see that they really see moms as omnipotent. So you could have your child outside and they could be riding their bike or trike and they hit a rock and it makes them fall off their bike, and they'll come running in and be mad at you because you didn't tell them they were going to fall off their bike. They just have this belief that you know everything, predict everything, and so on. And I warn parents during this particular stage that you have to be careful not to feed into that. Otherwise, it just feeds them blaming you more. Because if you say things like, I can see you with the back of my eyes in the back of my head, kind of teasing, they're already believing in your omnipotence. So you don't want them to think that you truly can see and predict everything that's going to happen. So the other thing that's really nice about 5 is that if you have an anxious child, it's an age where kids are not worriers. They tend to be way more centered at 5 than you would have seen at 4 and 3. So that's your 5. They're just super sweet. Now, 5.5 is a different story. As they're starting to move to that next stage, you're going to see at 5.5 way more readiness to be disobeying you. They're going to be more brash and combative at 5.5. One of the really major characteristics of 5 is they are dawdlers. They dawdle to eat. They dawdle to bathe. So it's kind of a way for them to have some power. So they just will take forever to eat. They will take forever to get dressed. They're just very, very hesitant about everything. It's kind of the beginning of a more moody stage again. So you're going to see a little shift from that really positive 5 stuff. Tantrums are going to start to get more intense again. Physically, you're going to hear your kids talk about stomach aches is a real common one. They talk about headaches for the first time. Some of them will actually be able to say their head hurts, that kind of thing. And then it must be a particularly growth period because we see this at 5 and we see it again at early adolescence, like I would say 11 and 12, which we'll hear them start to talk about their faces hurting, their feet hurting, which generally has to do with what we believe has to do with like bone growth. And so you'll hear some complaints about what's wrong with them physically. Tension wise, a lot of chewing, probably because they're starting to teeth again in terms of getting their permanent teeth and losing their baby teeth. So we see them doing a lot of kind of this kind of thing, chewing on their clothes or pulling them up like this and chewing on clothes. We'll see them pull their hair into their mouth and chew on their hair. So they do a lot of chewing. You'll see them doing a lot of sort of tapping things, taking a pen or a pencil and just tapping it away. So you can start to see a lot of that nervous energy. I think one of the most disturbing things that people see and don't understand is that not only are they kind of chewing on things, but sometimes, and again, remembering that with teething now, that literally means they're getting like 6-year-old molars. And so you will see them put literally their whole hand clear back in their mouth. Sometimes you'll even hear them gag themselves, putting their hands into their mouths, and you'll see drool running down their arms and coming off their elbows because they literally are using their whole hand as sort of a teething tool. So I just again want to normalize this. And anytime that you don't see something as normal and you say things like, get your hands out of your mouth or stop chewing on your clothes, it's like you're just going to make them more uncentered. And then the more uncentered they are, the more they're going to use that same behavior. So anytime you want to change something like that, you have to add something to it that's going to be acceptable. So if they're chewing on their clothes, maybe you would say, hey, you want to chew some gum? You want some gum? I'll give you some gum. Or you might get them a sport bottle to chew on, that kind of thing. So just understand that that is really what's going on with them. In terms of other people, they love and want to please their moms the most. They're close, but like I said, they expect her to know everything. They're close at 5.5, they start to take things out on moms. So they love moms still. They're still really enmeshed with moms at 5.5, but they start to get more critical than loving at 5.5 around moms. And I think what's really hard about this is that it's about 5.5 where they just start adoring dads. And so moms are sort of blamed for everything and dads are considered to be, their perfect person. So grandparents, extremely important. For the first time, a lot of these kids really, really value their grandparents, want to spend time with them, want to stay alone with them, that kind of thing. They get along best with the peers outside their family. In other words, they don't do that well with their siblings. They do better with other kids at this age. And then the thing about, I think that is really important to know is that they eat well. So we talked about that dawdling, but if you can just sort of get up from the table and be doing dishes and letting them sit there for as long as they want to sit there, you can actually get a lot of food into them. Now, they like their food really simple, and they don't like their food to touch. So you'll notice that they don't want casseroles because the food's all mixed up. They don't like it when you have mashed potatoes and gravy and the gravy happens to slide into the vegetable or onto a piece of their bread or whatever else they're eating. So they don't want their food to touch. They want their food simple. Sleep is generally not an issue at 5. It's common, though, for them to have a lot of dreams. So you'll notice they're dreaming a lot and kind of crying out in their dreams. But from their perspective, they sleep well, and they sleep well through the night generally. Toileting is not much of an issue. By 5, most of the kids have figured out their toileting routines. Bedwetting, though, is still normal and common. So I want to remind people that it is normal to wet the bed all the way up to age 8, and sometimes even through age 8. So what it is, and the difference why some kids don't wet at night and why some kids do, is that if you have a child who's a really deep sleeper, they sleep hard once they fall asleep, and they just have a little bladder, they're going to wet the bed. So sometimes we just have to wait till they get big enough that they have a bladder that they can hold all the way until the next morning. And then oftentimes I'll say, don't let your kids linger in bed in this stage. Get them up right away, because sometimes they actually won't wet the bed till when they first wake up, and then they wet the bed. Some people, because they don't want to deal with the bed wetting or the diapering at night at this age, will do what we call peeing the kids at night. And that's where you literally don't wake them up. You just pick them up asleep. You put them on the toilet and you tell them to pee, and in their sleep they pee, believe it or not, and then you put them back to bed, and that's enough sometimes to get them to get through the night around that. So so questions about any of that so far?
Yes. So if they wear a pull-up to bed, so you're saying that partially through the night, get them up and put them on the toilet and have them pee, and then basically just put Stillas or pull-up on, and hopefully they won't wet in the morning?
Yeah.
Just somewhere during the night.
I usually do it before you go to bed. You don't even have to wait during the night.
Okay.
So like if you put them to bed at 7:30 and you go to bed at 10, say, then just before you go to bed, just get them and empty that bladder out.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
But don't wake them. Is everybody clear? Because a lot of people say, oh, they're miserable. And I'm like, you don't wake them. You literally just kind of pick them up asleep and stick them on the toilet. And in their subconscious, they pee.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bathing wise, they're pretty independent, but they're, as we talked about, they dawdle, and they're kind of little space cadets at 5. So you put them in a tub and you'll say, be sure and wash your feet, and you'll come in 5 minutes later and they're kind of in this little zoned out place, like, and they're just still washing their feet, and you'll say, okay, wash your knees, and they kind of move up, start on their knees. You come in 5 minutes later and they're still washing their knees. It says they're just kind of little spacey at this age, so you just have to keep reminding them. But if you can remind them, they're pretty independent about bathing. There's a lot of what they'll say is I can't, but it's a little bit meaning I don't want to, and a lot of that has to do with sort of the self-reliant behaviors, dressing, brushing their teeth, combing their hair, bathing sometimes. And so what by that I mean, they'll say, I can't put on my clothes, meaning I don't want to. And I really don't want to make a big deal about any of those things at this age. You don't know anybody who's 15 who isn't dressing themselves or brushing their own teeth, or it's going to happen. And we see this more at this developmental stage with the boys. A lot of the girls are more self-reliant. We're not exactly sure what that's about, if it's socialization or just the difference in sort of focus. But we'll see more boys than girls who don't want to dress and don't want to brush their own teeth or hair or whatever.
Hey,
But
Candace.
I would move, yeah, go ahead.
So back a little bit when you were talking about, not wanting food touched and things on their plate touching and being more picky and finicky about food. Do you just accommodate the child on
Yes.
that? Okay.
Yes, you really do. The thing that I like about development is that you can really step back and decide which things are really, as people will say, pick your battles or whatever. It's like if something's not health and safety and you know that 5-year-olds don't want their food to touch, but 6 months later they're not going to care, it's not worth fighting at a mealtime for. So a lot of people will just go back to sort of more those toddler plates where everything is separated by those little compartments just to keep
Yeah.
the food out and just not have that fight about it. So yes, it's okay, you guys. I want to say it's okay to accommodate things that are not going to hurt anybody else when they're in developmental stages, because those things are just going to pass if you do anything or not. Those behaviors are going to pass because they're developmental. So it really does help you sort of assess what are the things I really do have to address and what are the things that are going to be gone no matter what we do anyway. And so it just really saves your connection to them. So you're not fighting over things you don't need to fight about or aren't important to fight about. Now, with that I can't dress myself, I can't do my hair. I don't really want people getting, again, into battles about that. I'd rather have you kind of move around from day to day. Like some days you might say, I'll tell you what, you get on your pants and shirt and I'll put your socks and shoes on. Some days you might say, oh, I could dress you today. I don't have anything I have to do this morning. Some days you're going to say, hey, babe, I have to get ready because I have to go with you to school today. So you're going to have to dress yourself. So if you move around on it without sort of getting into that, you need to do this yourself. You're a big boy, you're a big girl. You'll find that you're going to get less resistance and that they actually will get more self-reliant much more quickly. So try not to get into all of that power struggle. You have to remember that most of us grew up in really autocratic style of parenting, where we just wanted kids, one, to obey us. That was just what they were supposed to do, and that they didn't get to have developmental stages. You just fought like you fought through something until it changed, and they didn't know that it wasn't because they yelled at them to get dressed every day that they got dressed at 6 or 6.5 or 7, sometimes for the boys. But they would have done that anyway without that fight. And so we now know that so much of this is developmental, and that really helps us be able to step back and, one, be more creative about how we deal with it, and also to give us, like I said, that opportunity to decide if we even want to have that battle, knowing that it's something that's probably going to pass in 6 months. Okay, so that's basically what it looks like for your 5-year-old. So any big questions about 5 before we move on to 6? Okay. All right. So 6 is a really different thing. Those of you who have 4-year-olds, or if you remember your 4-year-olds, and sort of the intensity of 4, that bigness we talked about where they're loud and all of that, it's like 4 on steroids, basically. It's more intense. It's a really intense year. It's considered a year of equilibrium because they actually feel good about themselves. I think a lot of parents consider 6 a year of disequilibrium because they're so hard to deal with. But the kids are fine. It's the parents who struggle with 6 because they are so big. We call them bipolar because one minute they can be laughing and happy and cooperative, and the next minute they're just the opposite. They just have these great big extremes of emotion. They live on opposite ends. They can't make choices about anything. So those of you who are using choices a lot when your kids were younger, it's like for 6, it's like asking for a tantrum to happen because they just can't choose. And you especially don't want to give choices when they're tired or when they're stressed. So maybe you could give choices in the morning and then you do something else in the evenings because it's just too hard for them. They're incredibly stubborn. They still adore their mothers, but again, if anything goes wrong, they're going to blame the mom. They want to be, this is one of the characteristics that can make people crazy. They want to be first at everything. They want to be best at everything. So they constantly are competing. They are running to the car to say they're first. They start screaming with tantrums if they didn't get the first plate served. They want to be sure that they'll say, well, who's the fastest? Who's the best? They're constantly competing with everyone in the house and everyone around them. It's just constant. They want to win everything. And again, I like people to know this, that they're competitive and they want to win. So one of the characteristics of 6 is they cheat a lot because it's way more important to win than to play fair. And so I'll say to parents, you can fight that because people say, well, I want them to learn to be a good sport. I want them to learn how to lose. 6 is not the year to teach them how to lose. 6 isn't the year that you're going to teach them to be good sports. They're just going to freak out and everybody's going to be a mess because winning is the most important thing. If you don't want to have to deal with them changing the rules in the middle of the game or moving their markers a little bit, don't play with them. If you really don't want to play with them, that's up to you. But if you're going to play a game with a 6-year-old, you can pretty much guarantee they're going to change the rules and or cheat to win. And that will be gone again in a year. So don't get caught up in having these big battles over things that are literally just developmental. Along with that, they want the most of everything. So this is the age where you'll see kids, if food is sitting out, they'll be looking at all the plates to see which is the biggest piece of cake, for example. So they want the biggest and the most. Yeah.
We have a question. How common is it for struggles with winning to begin around 5 or 5.5?
It's really common because you're starting to see that we're moving to that year and year. So really, I almost think of 5.5 and to 6.5 as the year, because you'll start to see them get more and more competitive, but they're not as competitive as you'll see at 6. So yes, it is not unusual to start to see it at 5.5. Now, one of the things you're going to notice as you go through development with your kids is that you always will have what's happening developmentally that you can check out. You also will always have that interfacing with who they are temperamentally. Temperament is your hardwiring. It's your genetic makeup of how you sort of are in the world, your characteristics. So if you have a kid you've seen from the time they were little that are competitive, and then they hit a competitive age like 6, those kids are going to be off the chart competitive. If you have a child who's not very competitive temperamentally, sometimes 6, even though it's a really competitive age, isn't really a big deal because they just aren't temperamentally interfacing with that development. So you always sort of have to put those two together at any developmental stage to kind of be able to predict what you're going to see. Okay, other questions about that?
We just had one comment. It sounds like Luminaria 3 with her bigger sister, Sky 8.
Yes. And so that's exactly right. And 8 is another, year of, they're not as competitive at 8, but it's a brash year. It's a power year again. So you've got 2 power years together. You've got a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old. And so that can actually be a really hard combination in terms of kids getting along. All right, so they want to get that biggest piece. They want to win. They're beginning to separate, but they have a lot of anxiety. So you start to see a lot of separation anxiety again that you hadn't seen for a while. They refuse to stay in bed. They want to be in bed with you. They want to be close by. Again, one of the things that I think drives a lot of people crazy about 6 that is really characteristic is they do a lot of what we call smart talk, talking back. And that's really hard because, of course, a lot of us grew up with you don't talk back to your parents. And so it's a big trigger for people. But it's just developmental, and it's just because they're so full of themselves that they don't even mean to necessarily be nasty, but they just can't help but sort of like have a lot of bravado, and you're not that smart, and and parents are really triggered. But the truth is that sometimes all you have to say is, the way you said that hurt my feelings, and they're kind of shocked because they really aren't intending to really be as offensive as they actually can appear to be at those times. They can't be wrong. They don't deal well with criticism at all. They are constantly wanting to be praised and flattered. So they're bringing you pictures. They're constantly saying, did I run? How did I run? Did I run good? Do I look good? They just thrive on flattery and don't deal with criticism. They're very, very sensitive emotionally. So it doesn't take much for them to fall to pieces. They easily, if they're tired, do what we call spillover. And if a child spills over, you're kind of done for the day. You just kind of manage them, get them into bed, and start the next day. But they kind of go, go, go. But after a certain point, the straw breaks, and that straw breaks camel's back, and you're done for the day. And you just manage and get them into bed. There's no sort of coming back from it. They're very bold, very brash at this age. They're reactive to physical hurts, incredibly reactive. So any of you who've had your kids in the little kids sports where they play soccer, or maybe you're starting to play a little basketball or whatever, you'll notice that half of the games are with the kids lying down, crying and rubbing a leg as if they've been mortally wounded. That is just where they are. Every hurt is a major hurt for them. But they're very enthusiastic. They love games. They love academics. It's like a really big year for happiness and growth. And they're emotionally warm. I mean, they don't mind telling you how much they love you and kissing and hugging on you and all of that. Now, so that's your 6. Before I go into 6.5, any questions about kind of what to expect from your 6? So you can see why for parents, 6 can be challenging. Even though it's a good year for them internally, it's a challenging year for parents just because they're so intense. Now, 6.5 is again that transition where we're moving into that year by year. So 6.5 is starting to look a little more like 7. And a lot of people love 6.5 because all of a sudden the kids start to become more withdrawn. And after having a year of that intense, or 6 months of that intensity, and sometimes a year if you start at 5.5, they're like, a little withdrawn suits me fine right now. So actually 6.5 can feel really good to people. They're nice, they're warm, they're a little more withdrawn and melancholy, as we talked about. They have a good sense of humor. They can be kind of charming and talk about being kind of grown up and healthy, helpful, I meant to say. They love things like guessing games. Routine wise, 6 is the year of horrific table manners. We don't see table manners this bad again until they're 14, believe it or not. 14 is another bad year. But 6 is a really bad year. They're stuffing their mouths, they're grabbing food, they're knock their milk over every meal. It seems like they're teetering back in their chairs and sometimes kind of standing up. Is like not a fun year to sit and eat with a 6-year-old. What's really interesting about this, though, with 6-year-olds is that they are incredibly critical of their peers. So you'll hear them come home from school and they'll say things like, "Oh, I can't even stand with Johnny at lunch because he just stuffs his mouth." And you're kind of looking at him like, if you could just see yourself in a mirror. So they don't tolerate bad manners in each other, but they are completely oblivious to their own table manners. They eat painfully slow, painfully slow. But if you can hang in there, they'll generally eat pretty well. Again, always wanting that biggest piece of food, the biggest serving, etc. Sleep-wise, usually they get about 11 hours of sleep. They usually go to bed pretty readily because they really kind of do wear themselves out with all their own intensity, and they rarely have bad dreams. So you don't hear a lot of that sort of crying out in their sleep like you saw at 5, much less of that. Bathing wise, you start to see them become resistant again. So they prefer not to. They definitely don't want their hair washed ever. They don't want their hair combed ever. So hygiene it's definitely a year of resistance and struggle with hygiene. And I really want to remind parents all the time, it's like, really focus on health and safety. You do not have to wash their hair every night. You definitely don't even have to wash it every other night. You wash their hair when they start smelling like a dog, then wash their hair. And you can do things like you can wash their hair in the sink and they don't even have to take a bath. So find ways that you don't get caught up in having fights about this hygiene, because this too is going to change probably in 6 months, but you get a lot of resistance. And the thing about hair is a lot of people will be self-conscious because their kids are heading off to school. So they want them to look like they're good parents and don't smell and their hair's combed, etc. But if you look, all of the kids in 1st and 2nd grade have those little weird knotty things in the back of their head because nobody wants their hair combed. And so sort of step back and remind yourself, health and safety are your fights. If it's not health and safety, then you're going to find another strategy around it. Their tension outlets at 6 are a lot of wiggling, a lot of swinging their legs around. The one that's most common is picking their nose. If you ever sit in story circle in 1st grade, you will see that they're listening to the story and 2/3 of them have their finger up their nose. So it's a centering behavior to put your finger in orifices, and your nose is a handy one. So it's a very common behavior to pick their nose. Now, with that said, if you look down at health, it's also a year where we see a lot of high communicable diseases, lots of colds and things. And it's no question sort of how and why, because they're all picking their nose and putting their hands in their mouths and touching things. So they spread stuff like crazy because of that behavior at that age. In terms of other things, tantrums, incredibly violent again. I really want people to know that that's normal. It doesn't mean you're not going to address them and set limits on them. At this point, they cannot destroy property. They cannot hurt other people. They cannot hurt themselves. So they can't do things like bite themselves or hit themselves in the head. They can't kick, hit, bite other people. They can't throw things or kick things. So you're going to help them learn to manage what they can do with that intensity, but they're incredibly intense around their tantrums again. Screaming, crying, physical. And then you're going to replace that with things that are acceptable outlets for those tantrums. Health-wise, lots of aches and pains and sensitivity that we started to see at 5.5. Throats and ears especially are really vulnerable. You're going to see that your kids are going to fall more. They're just clumsier. When they're in disequilibriums, they tend to be more clumsy. And so they fall more, get hurt more that way. So that's kind of your 6. Any questions about your 6-year-old? Okay. All right. So 7 is your first full year of disequilibrium. So from here on out, 7 disequilibrium, 8 equilibrium, 9 disequilibrium, etc. First full year. And we call 7 the Eeyore year. Eeyore like Winnie the Pooh Eeyore, because this year particularly, the glass is empty, not even half empty. The glass is empty, and they just see the world through that really empty glass in every way. So they're very withdrawn and they are very pulled in. It's really common, for example, for me to get a call from a parent and they'll say, you know, how do you know when a child is depressed? And I'll say, how old are they? Because I can almost guarantee that if they're asking me in early grade school, they have a 7-year-old. And it's really hard because if you've gone through this 6-year-old and you've had this child who's just been out there and social and seems happy, and suddenly you've got this withdrawn, negative little Eeyore, you start to wonder if there's something really wrong. But this is just typical 7 years old. So they're more silent. They don't really talk or engage much when there's company. They feel that people in their lives, particularly their mothers and their teachers, are the 2 that they most feel like this about. But they feel like they're mean and hateful and pick on them, particularly pick on them. They think that people don't like them. They're worried about people not liking them. They're moody. They're moody. They're morose. They're melancholy. They're huge worriers. So this is one of those age that if you have an anxious child temperamentally and you hit 7, you'll see this high anxiety really show up at age 7. They are afraid of the dark. They're very fearful of being late for school is hugely a big fear. They don't want people looking at them. They worry about shapes in the dark. It's a fearful year. They think they have all the bad luck. Everybody's luckier than they are. They feel like their parents love every sibling better than they love them. So they're the least loved sibling. They're easily disappointed. So let's sort of stop there. I just want to give you a chance to sort of ask questions about sort of how negative this can be. Do we have a question, anyone?
Yes, we have one question. Isn't 7 when social changes start happening too? They start picking on their own friends. I think that's what I mean.
Picking out their own
to pick
friends.
out their own friends, which can
They
cause
do, but it's interesting. I mean, you'll see some of it at 6, but one of the things that's hard for parents is that I do think they're more introspective. So they are literally sort of more conscious of like sort of picking what they like, not only in friends, but in sort of life and sort of being more self-defined. But they also are so withdrawn. And this is one of the things that's really hard for parents because they won't want to go to anybody's house. They don't want to have any friends over. And so that really scares parents. And I'm saying, you know, I'm not worried about that. If you see that carry over into 8, then we want to look at what else could be going on. But if you see your kids sort of have this year of, I just want to stay home. I don't want to deal with anybody. I don't want anybody over. That has to do with where they are developmentally, which is they are withdrawn and they are worried about people liking them. And sometimes it's just the safest way for them to be at 7 is just to be sort of separated out. So they'll just do that to themselves.
We have one more question.
Yeah.
At 7, how can we help kids who are socially isolated due to COVID and seeming to be depressed and negative all the time?
So here's what's interesting, because this has come up, and we don't know what's what at 7. I mean, you could have found that even without COVID, and if they were in school, that you would have seen the same behavior, and it may not be COVID at all. Or it could be that the behavior is exacerbated, made worse by COVID. So, I don't know that we have any way of teasing that out. I just always want to remind parents not to assume with a 7-year-old that, sort of buy into and feel guilty and sort of get caught in getting enmeshed with them about trying to get them happy. I don't ever want people to invalidate them like, oh, you're such a negative Nelly or whatever. It's like, it's real for them. This is how they feel and see the world. But it's just for this year. And I don't want parents to get caught up in thinking that, they're scared that this is going to be how they are in life. This is not how they're going to be in life. So, you're just going to try to reassure them when you need to, but also not get too caught up in sort of that really negative sort of way of looking at life and the world. So from there, we talked about them having all the bad luck. They feel like their parents love their sibs more. They're more reasonable. Actually, the interesting thing about 7 is at home, it's painful to be around them. And we'll talk about some of the other behaviors that make that the case. At school, they're excellent students. They are good listeners. They're good focusers. They want to do a good job at school. They are reasonable in ways they weren't able to be reasonable at 6. They do have trouble transitioning. So one of the things we do see them struggle with at school is to go from one activity to another activity. So transitions are hard at home and at school. But for the most part at school, parents are always sort of surprised at how well kids are doing and how complimentary teachers are about their kids, because they don't really see those same behaviors that we oftentimes experience with them at home.
I have another question. Can ADHD change these developmental stages, or do they follow the same route?
So it's kind of another interface. That's a great question. So they follow the same route, but again, if you're going to interface it with, the age, if you have a withdrawn age, you may see the ADD sort of tamper down a little bit. And then with 8, you may see the ADD really skyrocket again, because now you're also back into a more distractible age, etc. So it does actually follow the same, but you're going to see it definitely be another impact, like we see temperament be an impact. Okay. Anyone else?
I had one more question. What are the ages of discoordination again?
Disequilibrium?
Yes, disequilibrium. I always get that mixed up.
Disequilibrium. So it's starting at 7. It will be every other year. So 7 is disequilibrium, 8 is equilibrium, 9 is disequilibrium, 10 is equilibrium, 11 is disequilibrium. So every other year starting at 7. Before age 7, it's every 6 months. So there'll be 6 months of equilibrium, 6 months of disequilibrium. And the 6 months of disequilibrium tends to peak at the half year. So a little before, a little after the half year are your disequilibriums in the younger ages. Okay, anyone else? Okay, so the other thing you'll notice is they don't have a very good sense of humor. If teasing or kind of joking was one of the ways you sort of dealt with kids to get them out of grumpy moods or whatever, it can backfire on you. So warn people who are teasers that this is not the year to try to use that kind of humor, because they don't have much ability to laugh at anything, including themselves. They retreat a lot. They want to be sure that they have space around them, and they're very spatially sensitive. And by that, I mean they have their chair at the table and they flip out if a sibling hops into that chair. Like that's their chair. They have a place they sit in the car and they don't want anybody else sitting in the car in that place. So they're incredibly spatially sensitive, including their own bodies. So you'll notice that they are sort of almost touch averse a little bit, and parents are always a little taken aback because you'll go to put their hand on their back or hand on their shoulder, and you'll kind of see them like that, like, don't touch me. And that's because they have that spatial sort of need. And so it's not that they are rejecting you, it really is about that spatial sensitivity. So they're very, very, very high self-standards. And so their anxiety and perfectionism are off the charts. But I actually like 7 for that, because a lot of times the first time parents recognize that perfectionism is at 7. And I'm like, yay, because if you recognize some of these characteristics at 7, you can start working on them so they don't become so debilitating when they're 10, 12, 16. So this would be the stage where you'd start to see perfectionism show up, if it was going to start to show up in kids. They have more control over their body, more control over their voice, more control over their emotions. So that's why it's interesting. Some of the parents will actually say, I don't think of 7 as disequilibrium, because 7 really, other than those little things about them sort of being negative, it's easy to manage. They're not loud, they're not imposing. So for parents, it actually can almost feel like a year of equilibrium if they're not worried about them. So, but for the kids, it's definitely an internal year of disequilibrium. Now, the other thing is they are really not good with siblings at 7, partially probably because of that sense that they never get enough, that everybody loves them more, partially because of the spatial stuff. But if they could choose, they would not have a sibling. They aren't ever going to probably instigate or bug a sibling. That's not sort of how they are. They just are so annoyed by them. So if they didn't have siblings, they would be great. That's kind of where they live at 7. And they don't need as much companionship. They just don't need friends around as much. And that is hard for people who have been used to their kids really having a lot of play dates and being really social. So that's your 7-year-old. That's your Eeyore year. So questions about 7? Okay. All right. So some of you have kids that in general, when we talk about temperament, in general, some of you have kids who are temperamentally just intense at every age. And it's not a particular characteristic, they're just intense little people. And so you are the people, the parents, who are going to notice that all of these stages are like so spelled out and drastic. You don't have a little Eeyore, you have a major Eeyore. You don't have a little bit of a competitive 6, you have a really competitive 6. And so what's hard is that parenting isn't equal. It's not equal between parents, because some of you have way less intense children, and you'll hit these stages and they just aren't going to be as hard to tolerate and manage as some of you who have these really intense kids, and these stages just hit and hit hard. So, and even within families, you'll have kids who have the more intense temperaments who are much harder to manage at these ages, and kids who will sort of sail through some of these ages, if not all of them, and not even really have a lot of struggle. Okay. So with that said, we're going to go to 8. Any questions before I start 8? Okay, so 8 is a year of equilibrium. So when we talk about 8, you're going to notice that all these kids who were withdrawn and negative are outgoing, they're lively, they're evaluative, and by that I mean that they're talking about, what's good in the world, what's good in them. They're just really positive. They have high high energy levels. I just want to say this is a huge component of them. They're willing to tackle anything, but they're speedy. Everything is speedy. They run to the car, they run around the house, they're just running constantly. And as a result of that, they get hurt a lot. They're careless. They run in, you'll see kids with these little marks down the middle of their face where they just aren't paying attention, and they're running into their bedrooms and literally hit their door jams because they're so speedy and careless. They break things a lot because they just don't take their times to handle things. They just are speedy, speedy, speedy. They tend to be very evaluative and hard on themselves. I talked about what they like good about themselves, but they can also be pretty self-critical of themselves. And they also are really sensitive to other people's criticism, including perceived criticism. So you could say something like, "You are getting so big," and they'll turn around and they'll say, "I'm not fat." It's like they perceive criticism where it doesn't even exist. Or you could say, "I can see you're working really hard on that." And they're like, "What? You don't think it's good?" And you're just like, "No, you're working hard on that." There's nothing negative you're saying, but they are just quick to pick up that perception that they're being criticized. They're intellectually incredibly expansive. They love learning. They're good at learning. There's nothing they don't want to learn about. They talk constantly talking. And it's exhausting. It's nice when they're in school. Those of you who have 8-year-olds with COVID, you're probably pulling your hair out because they just don't stop talking. But at school, they can talk to friends, they can talk to the teacher, but it's exhausting how much they can talk. Everything is expressed with high drama. They love drama. They talk in drama. They move in drama. Their personal space is expanding, so they're not so sensitive anymore. They're willing to sort of share their space. They see the world as something that they want to move around in again. So it's a really sweet, sort of expansive year, especially after that year of 7 where they're so withdrawn and pulled in. They're more physical, again, in terms of their coordination. It's fun because 8 is the first age where you might see their adult body. Now, I say the first age you're going to see their adult body because we see their bodies morph for several years, all the way up through early high school. We'll see a lot of body morphing. And 8 is one of the years where they get sort of thinner, less pudgy, and sort of more muscular. And so for a few months, you get kind of a picture of what they might have as a physique when they're adults. But then that's very short-lived, and you might see them get sort of that sort of doughy look again before the next growth spurt. But it's kind of fun if you pay attention to what that looks like and in that particular age group. So questions about that? Okay. Emotionally and attitude-wise, they really are wanting to have relationships with their parents, with their peers. Everybody is important to them in terms of relationship. It's a big interpersonal year for them. They hope that others feel that way about them. They love being loved. So it's a very sweet year to interpersonally. They are, however, incredibly nosy. And this is the year where you're going to have to start to teach about privacy, both external privacy and internal privacy. So it is not unusual, for example, for parents to be having a discussion in their room that they're not particularly wanting their kids to hear, and they open the door and the kids fall in because they're literally leaning against the door trying to figure out what they're talking about. Or you'll hear they'll hear you talking on the phone, and they'll say, "Who are you talking to? What are you talking about? Who can't go to school? Why can't they go to school?" And so they are nosy nosy. And you're going to have to start to say things like, this is a private conversation. You know, you aren't part of this conversation. You aren't welcome in the room when we shut the door. That means you're not welcome to come in. So you're just going to start to help them understand that there are boundaries around people's personal communication and sharing and so on. But just understand that that nosiness is really developmental as well. Their performance at school, unlike 7, where they are really good, they love learning. They're excited about learning, but their performance is kind of mediocre. And part of that is just simply because they're speedy. Just like we talked about them speeding around the house, they speed through their work. They write fast. They answer their questions fast. They just want to do everything fast. And because they're doing it so fast, their penmanship doesn't look as good. They make more mistakes on their little math papers and that kind of thing. I really don't want parents involved in that. I don't want parents telling their kids to rewrite a paper because it's messy. I don't want parents telling them to go back and check to see if their paper is okay because they see they're making too many mistakes. Leave that to the teacher. This is not because it's developmental. It can undermine your connection to your kids if you start trying to manage that. Leave it to their teachers. Their teachers can tell them if they want them to rewrite something. Their teachers can tell them to be more cautious about checking their answers or whatever that might be. But a lot of times the teachers are used to this age being speedy in these kids' papers, and their mistakes look like everybody else's papers and mistakes at this age. So they aren't even that concerned about it. But I really do encourage parents not to get caught up in trying to monitor sort of the neatness and accuracy of their kids' work at home. I think that's particularly difficult right now with COVID because you are so the one monitoring. But remind yourselves that, you know, that you don't need to be as picky with this age group, and that when they go back to school, you're going to sort of really pull back and let the teachers give that kind of information. They're hard on others. They usually rationalize that they had to attack someone else because they were attacked first. So their perception is that they're always right and they wouldn't have to attack somebody unless somebody wasn't doing something to them first. They have that high need for praise we talked about, and sometimes that high need for praise comes with them starting off with disdainful thing they say about themselves. So they'll say something like, this is really a stupid picture of a dog, isn't it? You do not agree. Is everybody clear about this? The expectation is that when they say this is really a stupid picture of a dog, you say, no, that's so cool. I didn't know you could draw a dog that well. If you say, yeah, that is kind of whack dog, they're just devastated because they were using that as a way to elicit a compliment from you. Okay, so questions about your 8-year-old. Anybody? Are we good, Beth? Okay, all right. So 9 is your hardest year of these middle years, this 5 through 10. 9 is tough year. And I want to kind of prep you for that because I do think it really kind of brings parents a bit to their knees. But I also want to say to you, it's like a precursor to that pre-adolescent age of 11 through 13. And 9 is a little bit of what you're going to get at 11 and a very little bit of what you're going to get at 13. So it's going to kind of help you sort of ease your way into adolescent behavior and not be so kind of shocked about it. So 9 is really uneven, really unexpected. what could be said of your child one day could be completely different the next day. It's so hard to manage because you just feel like you're just being kind of tossed around in the sea of development with them. They're emerging from that long, strong preoccupation with mothers, which in some ways is really helpful. But the other side of this is that they're critical now of moms and dads. But it is kind of nice to have some of that negative focus that's been on moms a little more spread out. They're independent. They're very self-motivated. They're really good self-starters. Again, at school, honestly, most of the teachers will say that, these 9-year-olds are great. They're great students. Because they just don't see the interpersonal stuff that you see. However, at school, these kids are not particularly happy. And as we talk about this, you'll see why. So they're good students, but they aren't happy students at this age. And they definitely aren't happy little people at home. They want to do things their own way, in their own time, in their own direction. They do not like to be directed or expected to obey at this age. They do best if you give them some responsibility and give them a little independence. So if you could say things like, you need to empty the garbage. Do you want to do it before or after dinner? I have dishes and laundry to do. Do you want to pick one? You pick the one you want to do. A little bit of giving them some power can mediate a little of this, but they really, really don't like to be directed at all. They're anxious. So those of you who have the temperamentally anxious kids, 9 is one of the off the wall anxious ages that you'll be dealing with. Again, more withdrawn, less certain, less speedy by far than your 8-year-olds. They really are much more intentional, but also very withdrawn, similar to what you saw only with an older child. Seeing that withdrawn is even scarier than what you saw at 7. They do best, we talked about this, with the independence and responsibility. Did you have a question?
Yes, we have a couple. So hands down, I guess this is more of a comment. Hands down, this is the hardest year I've been going through it with my son. The anger 1 minute and the sensitive side the next.
Absolutely, right on. And it's why I want people to hear about development, because especially with something like COVID happening, you're thinking, oh my gosh, what has happened? Or what if you are going through a divorce at this time, or any of those things? You just take on all the responsibility. And that's why I want people to know, it's like, you may see this behavior if everything was going perfectly. This is just a really, really hard year. It's a hard year to be a parent. It's a hard year to be a kid. It's a hard year.
We have one question, and it says, why is it that children in stages of critical disequilibrium with parents tend to be more or most critical of moms?
Yeah. This is interesting because this is very true. We see them be almost entirely critical of moms, like we said, up until about 9. Then we see them kind of distributed. And at 11 and 13, they are incredibly disdainful towards mothers again. And we've wondered about that. We've looked at that, and initially we thought it was because they were sort of the primary caretaker. So we sort of figured, well, they were easily the one to be scapegoated. Some people will say it's because I'll come back to this one, because they know that they have probably trust the parent, the mother, the most in terms of unconditional love. But I want to go back to that other one first, about because they're the primary caretaker. Because in this last generation, we've seen the same behavior even when fathers are the primary at-home parent. That even if the mother is the not at-home parent, that's the one the child directs that criticism at. So that's really confused us, because now we're like, what is that about? The piece about that they trust that they can treat you the worst because, and be most critical of you because they feel the most secure with you. I think there's probably some truth in that, but there's unhealthy truth in that. And I have really been trying to work with mothers particularly to be able to not buy into that. I don't want the message to be that the people you love the most, you get to treat the worst. That is such an unhealthy belief system to have. And it's a belief system we see carried right into adulthood. We treat the people we love as adults the worst. We think we can treat our partners terribly because we think they're going to love us no matter what we do. We think we can treat our parents terribly because they're going to love us no matter what we do. We treat our children poorly because we think they're going to love us no matter what we do. And what is really scary about this is that is not true. There isn't a relationship that exists that isn't eroded away by disrespect and abuse. Is everybody clear about this?
Yes.
And so if we start with these little kids, giving them the message that, okay, yeah, you can treat me like that. And I mean, they'll literally say by the time they come into counseling with me at, 8, 9, or 10, they'll say, well, I'd never talked to anybody else like that. So they've already started to sort of be able to say to themselves that they can treat people they love badly. And that's okay. And so even though that is, and we don't know exactly where and what that's coming from, we still want to address that behavior. We still want to be able to say, I don't let anyone talk to me like that. Not you can't talk to me like that. I don't let anyone talk to me like that.
Mm-hmm.
Or, when you talk to me like that, it doesn't make me want to do things for you.
Yeah.
Or whatever it may be. It's like, don't get caught up in, well, they get to diffuse all their emotions on me and I'm just supposed to take it because I love them unconditionally.
We have a few more comments and questions.
Okay.
One is, I feel like stage 9 is totally speaking truth about my 5-year-old.
Okay. 5 or 5.5? Ask if it's a 5.5.
She's almost 6. She'll be 6 in April.
Yeah. So you're seeing some of that 5.5. So you're probably seeing some of it that, you're seeing temperament. So, but I'm telling you, what you're seeing at 6 is nothing like what you're going to see at 9, just to give you a sense of sort of how intense it can get.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
We have a couple of comments. So this explains so much of what I went through last year with my now 10-year-old.
Absolutely. This is why I wish everybody could have this every year.
Yeah.
Just to save them from feeling like bad parents or kids who are a mess. Mm-hmm. It's like, these are normal behaviors. Yes. Good.
Another comment is, I have a 5.5-year-old child in my family who is most critical of her father figure and is very close with me and her mother figure.
Okay, well, they definitely are closest with mothers. That's the given. It's not that they aren't close with moms. They are incredibly close with moms, and they are critical of them. I mean, it kind of goes both ways. But sometimes, yes, they will be critical of dads, and that I always am worried about because I worry about the connection. And so that's usually a sign of some rapport that needs to be built, some connection, more time alone, more positive time alone with them, so that they start to build that positive interdependence. Okay. Anybody else?
Next comment. So we have 2 more comments. One of them is, my daughter is definitely more critical of me and her stepfather, but she absolutely loves her biological dad because he's fun and doesn't discipline her.
Exactly. And I think that is probably really the case. But here's what I would say, and I just say this reassuringly. This is more the counselor part of me that deals with kids and hears them talk, is that They do adore those parents that are sort of the Disneyland parents, Disneyland dads or moms sometimes, and they do adore them because they do have fun and they like being loved. But when push comes to shove, they know who the real support people are. They absolutely do. They don't run to those dads they adore when they need support and guidance. They run to moms and or the dads, whoever happens to be in that role. Um, so I'm just saying that to reassure you, because I think it's painful to watch that and know that you're taking that role on of being the disciplinarian and the teacher and the coach, and that they don't seem to adore you the same way, but they depend on you in a much deeper way, a much deeper, intimate way. So that's just reassurance.
We have one question and then one more comment. And the question is, I struggle with my 7-year-old. How do I address it when I say I don't, or don't treat me like that, or don't talk to me in that way, and it still continues?
Okay, so here's the thing, you guys, is that number one, it's like when you say things like, don't talk to me like that, it's a challenge. And if you have a kid who's in a challenging age, moving into 8, particularly 6, it's like saying, talk to me like that. It's like, it's a challenge. You're challenging them. It's why I'm saying to you, and I'll say it again, when they talk to you, you say, babe, I don't let anyone talk to me that way. It's not a challenge. It's a statement. I don't let anyone talk to me that way. And then oftentimes it can, sometimes that's enough, but in this case, it sounds like you have a more intense child. And so then you have an action, and the action is, I don't let anyone talk to me this way. And you leave the room, or you walk away and go do something else. It's like, I don't let people do this to me. So take an action, but be careful, because, we grew up with that sort of, don't you do this to me? You can't act like that with me. That is a trigger to challenge you. And so it's having that sort of clear message with that detachment and action that's going to make the bigger difference. Okay, there's another statement.
One more statement. It says, let's do this again next year.
Okay, let me finish 9. I'll get to 10 before we finish. Okay. So they have a very, very high need for that external praise, mostly to do their internal demands. They're very self-critical, very critical of others. So it's both. The more self-critical are, the more critical they are of other people. That's just how it goes. They are perfectionists. So again, if you have a child who's a perfectionist, this goes off the charts in terms of perfectionism. They'll do the same drawing over and over again to try to do it perfectly. They don't know how to stop. So they'll have a project to do a map, for example, and and it might have just said outline a state. They outline a state, and all of a sudden you see them coloring the different areas of the state with colored pencil. Then you hear them say, where's some wax paper? And you see them getting wax paper, and they're shining their paper. And then you see them pull out the matches, and they're getting ready to burn the edges of the map to make it look like an old map. And you're like, whoa, enough, you're done. They can't stop. They just can't stop. There is just never enough perfection for them to stop. So it's exhausting. They definitely get wound up in their activities. They have very strong willpower. They can almost do anything if they put their mind to it. They don't leap at all recklessly. That 8-year-old stuff you saw is completely gone. And kind of grievous, because with that 8-year-old stuff, there was such a freedom that those 8-year-olds had, and such a confidence they had. And to see that confidence sort of dissipate is painful to watch, but normal at this age. They show lots of considerable social criticism as well as self-criticism. They have very, very intense emotions. They worry to the point, they worry a lot, they complain a lot. both of those things are as high as you're going to see until the middle years. They do, again, like intellectual things. In terms of things they like to do, love to collect. This is the year kids collecting rocks, start collecting stamps, start collecting baseball cards, that kind of thing. Fairness is more important to them than anything. It's more important than relationships. So you'll see them, the example I use is my son during this age. We had a family softball game at Mother's Day, and we just kind of divided everybody up really randomly, and we were just playing softball, and his team was losing, and he was like, he was so mad. These teams aren't fair. These aren't fair. And we were just like, oh, it's just a game. We're having fun. And he ended up throwing his bat down and walking away. And later, a couple days later, I went back and I was just talking to him. So what I thought was maturely. And I was saying, you know, hon, it's just a game. And if you act like that when games, people aren't going to want to play with you. And he kind of looked at me really seriously. And then he just said, well, I guess we won't be playing baseball together. It's like, done. It's like fairness is what matters. And that's all that matters. So it's a big, big deal that things are fair. And it's not always that they have the life experience to really understand what fair is. They love to talk with their friends. They have disdain for and distaste for the opposite sex. They're impatient, they're quick to anger, and they're incredibly persistent, but they are very loyal, very devoted friends, and their behaviors are influenced by their personality traits. So they're not all the same at 9, like we see at some of the ages. Okay, so questions about 9 before we move on.
We only had one comment, and it says, oh man, I remember being so intense about drawing my maps and projects at that age. It drove my mom nuts because it would be painful. I would be painfully perfectionist about every detail.
Exactly, exactly. So that is your 9, and it is hard and it is exhausting. I think it's a good exposure because it kind of helps you learn how to manage yourself as you start to move into, gives you a little window into what those prepubescent years are of 11, 12, and 13. But you get this little gift before you do that, and that is 10. And 10 is the most amazing, magical age. It is a year of perfection. It's a year where you like pat yourself on the back and you say to yourself, holy cow, you know, we did such a good job. We have the most awesome child, you know, and I just want you to like bask in that because you've got 11 coming. So bask in that year where you feel like your kids have got it and you've got it, because it is so sweet. They are compliant, they are friendly, they are enjoyable, they're predictable, they're consistent. I mean, it couldn't be more equilibrium than you get at 10. They aren't as fearful as they were previously, but they do have some unique fears. They don't want to fail at school. They do want to perform well at school. They don't want to get sick. They're a little bit what I would call hypochondriacal. They are worried about, you know, is this bump on my breast cancer versus just a breast bud, for example? Or if they cut themselves, they'll be like, I'm afraid I'm going to get an infection. So 10 probably struggled with COVID a lot. I would guess if there was anything that would have been hard for a 10-year-old this year, it would be the anxiety they might feel about getting sick or somebody around them getting sick, because they do have that. They also have a lot of sensitivity to heights, and vertigo is an issue at 10, but in general, they're super relaxed, they're super confident. They don't want anybody fighting. They don't want to fight with their sibs. They don't want their sibs to fight with them. They don't want their parents to fight with each other. They just want everybody to be loving and peaceful. They do worry about tests because, again, that performance piece, they do want to perform well. So they have some anxiety around tests and anxiety about school performance. They are very conscious of what people have for clothing and other possessions, and they want to do things like be like them and be on time. And so you're just seeing them trying to sort of fit in the most positive way they can possibly fit in. Sexuality is interesting because they are very sexual. So what we see is the sexual ages tend to be the years of equilibrium. So we'll see 6 is a very sexual age. 8 can be a sexual age. 10 is a sexual age. So we'll see 4 is a very sexual age. So you'll see in terms of sexuality at this age, there's a lot of same-sex sex play, kind of puppy love with peers of the opposite sex they'll talk about. Crushes on peers of the same sex they'll talk about. There's a lot of sort of smutty jokes and gestures and drawing naked pictures and things like that. We took turns taking our kids to the bus stop when one of my kids was at this age, and we would take them up to catch the bus, and so they had to ride in the van together. There were like 5 of them, and all about the same age. And my friend dropped by after picking the kids up and taking them because she wanted me to see what happened on the way to the bus that she wasn't aware of until they got off. But the windows were all fogged up. It was winter and the windows were all fogged up. And every window the kids had written fuck, which is so 10. So just that playing with words, playing with, their sort of their new awareness of sexuality and that kind of thing. Okay, so that's your.
Hey, Candice, I have a question too.
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead, Layla.
So because of their heightened sexuality, do they start like exploring body parts or being curious about other people's body parts?
Not too much. You see that more with younger kids. They, playing doctor and that kind of thing. So usually the older kids are more interested in, you do have to start watching like your internet, because they're going to, they'll start to not intentionally get on porn sites, but they start to look for like naked things, naked bodies, and then all of a sudden they're on a porn site, that kind of thing. So you see more of that kind of exploration, more kind of doing things like slapping butts, that kind of thing.
We have one question in the chat. It says, my 10-year-old is very prone to being emotional and emotional outbursts toward her siblings. I do wonder if this is because she's starting to go through puberty.
Very easily you could be. That's a really good insight, because that is one thing, again, that's going to interface with this, is where they are in development in terms of physical development. So if you're starting to see them develop breasts or have body odor, that there's a very good chance you are seeing ups and downs, hormonal ups and downs, and they are so irregular when they first start, in terms of, not only just not starting their periods, but just the irregularity of the hormones before they actually start to have their periods, that it really isn't very manageable. So that's actually probably a good insight, that if you're noticing they're particularly emotional or particularly intolerant, particularly if you kind of see it up and down, like you see that sweetness we're talking about, and then all of a sudden they just seem like they don't have that capacity to manage, I'll bet you are starting to see it interface with some hormones. Good.
I have 2, well, I guess it's all kind of a run-on one. So 10 years old, my 10-year-old thought the world was literally going to end with the riots and COVID. He had such a great year. He is really into his looks this year, and the only main issue we have had this year is pushing boundaries or forgetting rules constantly, being nosy in adult business, and antagonizing his little brother. Does this ever end, or is it forever? Besides these things, I love 10. Also, when is a good time to start talking about sex and safety in that sense? I want to be open and start at a young age, but he doesn't seem interested just yet.
Yeah. Okay. So let me answer the first one first. So if your 10-year-old is starting to move towards 11, some of that behavior you're seeing is 11. So one of the behaviors we see as we're going to be talking about 11, 12, 13, our next session. But just quickly, one of the things that happens is at about 11 or 12, depending on when you sort of start puberty, the brain changes and that gray matter thins. We call that brain pruning, and that thins really drastically, and we start to form our adult brain. So 10-year-olds perform at this really high level, and then there's a sudden dip in 11 that has to do with brain development, because when we lose those synapses and start to form the new synapses for our adult brain, you are distracted, disinterested, and disorganized. And that isn't somebody being resistant. That is literally they can't hang on to things. They're not purposely not emptying the garbage when you tell them. It's just that 10 seconds later, something distracted them and they forgot to empty the garbage. Literally forgot. It's like that. It's in, it's out. And so you have 3 years of really challenging brain development. It's going to come at 11, 12, 13. And my guess is, listening to you, that you're getting the 10, but you're also getting a little bit of that brain change that's coming. In terms of the sexuality, you absolutely want to be talking about sexuality. I actually start having people talk about it at 5. I want people, if their kids haven't started to ask them questions, I say, I want you to start introducing this information, because I want kids to have the most accurate information, not what they hear on the playground from other kids. So you want to start introducing it and think of it as a process, not as an event. And so in terms of this age group, it's like I want to be sure that people are starting to introduce more and more and more about sexuality, and not just the functions of sexuality, but the responsibility, body sovereignty, all kinds of other little issues about that. And if you wait too long and you get your kids too close to that pubescent age, it's almost like too close. I can't hear it. It's just too close to me for me to be comfortable dealing with this. So if you can catch them at that 9 or 10 age before they really hit that, they're more curious than they are sort of like distasteful. So, and you can try and remember, it's like you want to see this as a process. You don't want to have the talk. So you're just going to keep talking about sexuality. And you probably want to have a couple good books around. And I'm trying to remember some of the, there's a really good one that American Girl has, I know people like a lot. And I'm trying to think of one of the boys, Growing Up Male. But you can probably look them up. I'll try to see if I can find them as well. But there's some really good books you can keep around. So if they just want to look something up or talk and see what people say about masturbation or whatever that may be, that, you have something they can use as a resource and have some privacy. I also want people to be aware of Growing Up Male and Growing Up Female. If you don't know about those programs, those are the Planned Parenthood programs that the high school teenagers do from the Teen Council of Planned Parenthood, where they come in and they talk about sexuality and they do some exercises around sexuality, and they answer questions for the kids. And it's great because it's nice for them to have kids just a little bit older than they are who are actually doing the information, and it's not as intimidating for them, kind of makes them feel cool. But those you can sign up for through Planned Parenthood. And I don't know exactly how they're doing them right now, if they're doing them right now with school, not in place, but just so you know, that's a resource. It's also a super good resource for that.
We had one question and one comment, and one of them was, can we do a Zoom on that? And so I think we'll our Healthy Families program. We'll probably discuss with Candyce and possibly schedule that at a future time.
Okay.
And then one of them, it says the 11 definitely sounds how my stepdaughter was at 10. She's just starting to go through puberty and is a woman now. She completely shuts down, I assume, talking about sexuality and hates the bras.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a perfect example of what starts to happen is it just becomes so real. And they're just kind of resisting moving into that phase, and they are very resistant, but we can talk about how to manage that later too. Okay, anybody else? Okay, that's it. It's your information for today, and then the next one will be 11, 12, 13.
There was one comment that says, Mama Dr. Jones on YouTube has a lot of really good information about sexual health and safety from a medical standpoint.
Great resource. Thank you. All right, you guys. Bye.
Thanks so much, Candyce.
You're
Bye.
so welcome. Have a good weekend.